Right now, I'm going to walk you through the mix of People Are Strange. Unlike Dream Shapes, I'm going to actually bring everything to zero and mix this song from scratch. Admittedly, I'm not happy with the final mix that we actually provided for the documentary. It's fine in terms of how it was used, but if I was putting this on vinyl, for example, I'd want it to be a little bit less muddy in some parts. I just during the epic parts at the end, I didn't quite hit the mark. So I figured it would be interesting for you to watch me mix it entirely from scratch. And at the minute, it's set the way it was when I finished mixing it. So what I'm going to do, like in the previous video, is take everything to zero. You can do that by clicking the first track, clicking on the last, bringing it down to zero. I'm going to leave the effects that I used on there, but I will go through some of them so that you know what I've done. I've got reverbs on there, some of this VHS chorus effect. Really, more gain staging is what I'm going to be doing in this video. I want to make sure that everything's balanced, and let's get stuck in. All right, so in previous videos, I talked about how it's important to sort of start your mix in the busiest area of the song. Select a loop, and then you can start mixing in that area. And then if you mix that section perfectly, the rest of the song should inherently be balanced. Now, again, the first thing I normally do is I add a mono effect on using gain. You can do that by clicking in here and going to utility, gain, stereo, and then you turn the mono on. Now, mixing a mono, like I explained in the previous videos, allows you to get the mix perfect in a mono space, and then when you turn that off, it automatically becomes stereo, and all of these effects that are affecting the stereo field, they then sort of get switched on, and it sounds massive. It's actually a little trick that I learned a long time ago. It's not something you have to do. It's personal preference. You can mix in stereo, and some people will get a better mix. But I find that if I get everything airtight in mono, turn that off, and it's automatically better. Now I've got it mono, and I'm going to go down here, and for this track, it's quite drum and bass heavy. And like most of my tracks, I like to start with the drums and the bass. Now we've got 4 basses in this track, so it may get a little bit messy, and I think that's probably the problem that I found in this mix. I'm gonna start with the drums, and again, like in the previous video, we're aiming to get everything below 10 decibels, minus 10 decibels with headroom, at least to start with, because later when you master, you're going to bring the whole mix up. That gives more space. If you get everything peaking very early into your mix, then when you try to turn other things up later, it causes distortion. It goes into the red, as they say, and that is bad. That is not. It's not a good mix. It's not a good practice. Not a good habit. So the quieter you make the entire mix down here, the more you can push everything up later. Now let's start with the drums. Okay, start with the kick. Again, I'm just gain staging here. I can do it in the mixer as well. Just bringing everything up here. That's hats. Usually start with the kick and snare. Now, I'll go through some of the effects I've got here. That should not be there. I'm going to go for some kind of kick. Let me see here. I like to use presets. It's encouraged. I mean, there's no shame in it. You can manually EQ from scratch. It's always good to get a start. I like to cut out the low end. A little boost around 60 to 80. Cuts out the middle. Let me just listen to that. It actually adds a bit of meat. Hear the difference? Tweak to your liking, basically. You can start from scratch. You can use a preset, and then you can change the preset. I can bring it down a little bit, maybe cut a little bit of that out. It's got a little bit of high end peaking. I mean, it all depends on the sound, the source sound. The kick, this kick sounds pretty solid on its own. Snare is something that you often struggle to get right with EQ. Let me just check what I've got on here. I've got I don't know what that's. Let me get some. I'd say go for like a rock snare. Bring a little wind out. See, I like how that sounds. Without. See how it's a bit flat. And what's happening here? It's boosting these frequencies here, which are often the frequency that the main sounds in it, that the timbre and a snare fall at. It's also raising the high end. You can use this graph here to sort of see what's going on with the snare visually. I mean, some people, it's completely possible to mix without actually hearing the song if you can get used to using the visualizers. You wouldn't do that, but it's possible. You can completely go in, and there's certain techniques and things that you do before you even really need to listen. Tom, and I've got a left and a right tom, and again, let me just solo these. A bit too much reverb on there. I've got this other snare, but I'm not sure if there's anything on there actually. No, I think that's a dead track. And I've got some hi-hats here, and they're very distinctive. And in fact, I think they get louder and louder. If I go into this MIDI, let me see. You can see here I've programmed in velocities so that these hi-hats get louder and louder and louder as the song progresses. Now that means that the dynamic is getting harder. It's hitting the drums harder and harder, as a real drummer would do. Now, I mean, this is quite messily done, but it worked for the track. Now let me just solo that. Like to remove a lot of the low end, especially on high end sounding instruments. Hi-hats don't need any low end. You can see there only is really high end up here. Like I said in the previous videos, you want to put like a low cut on pretty much most tracks, because it will remove any frequencies that maybe the ear can't hear, but that are going to clash whenever they get combined. I think that's well balanced for now. I'm not going to go too much more into that. This will be a very long video if I mix at the normal speed at which I do. Next, I would go for bass. I mean, you need to get the bass and drums sounding spot on. Let me see. We've got our bass sub and our bass synth. So, like I said earlier, the sub plays the low end, and this range is often around the same as the kick drum. So you got to make these two things complement each other, and the bass is the high end of the same bass sound. I'll get the sub up first. So you can see it's around here. Now what I would do here is I would look at the kick EQ. Okay, so this kick falls around here. Now, in order to make the kick and the sub bass complement each other further, go into the EQ and simply cut where the kick is hitting. Now, the bass or the kick sound any difference, but it's cutting out frequencies in the sub bass that would be competing with the kick, and it so therefore makes the kick sound clear. Make it a bit lighter. You can hear that kick clear. It can be always tempted to turn the bass up a little bit more, but what we're doing here is just balancing the track. So I'm going to bring that down, and there's a second bass that needs to go on top and fill that out a bit. Again, I've just put a low cut here, and as long as that cut cuts out that 60 to 80 range in the EQ, the frequencies, then the kick should still come through a bit. This is where it's probably been a bit busy and muddy in my previous mix, bringing all these bass layers in. I'll put in this growl and see how it sounds, and then we'll shape it. Just noticing that I had the VHS and EQ below it. You often want the EQ to be the first thing in your chain. You always EQ and then add effects after. It's just a good habit. Now I'm going to cut a lot of the low end out of that because the other basses can fill that, and all we're looking from this sound, this growl, is that gristly sort of high end. So I'll bring it up a little bit. This way. You'll notice now that I can't really hear the bass as well. That's because this is taken over a bit. So again, what we're doing here is trying to balance things out. Remember, we're trying to keep this below 10 at most times, and it's already a little bit high. I think that what's happening here is the bass. It sounds like the bass needs to be louder, but then that makes the drums sound quiet. So what I'm going to do here really is just bring all the basses down a little bit. It might not sound normal right now, but we want the drums to be sort of a bit louder, and it's better to turn the bass down than turn the drums up. I certainly feel like the snare needs to be turned up a little bit. And the hat. And then we've got another bass, and I mean, I might even delete it if it's competing too much with these basses. Oh yeah, it's nice and low. Just cutting out that range from this bass too, so that it allows space for that kick. The kick is, in my opinion, more distinct and more important than the sub bass. Keep it right there. Maybe allow you a little bit of this. Yeah. With EQ, what you can do is be very dramatic, like really cutting out everything and then bring it back down once you've hit the spot. It works the same. If you find out if you have a problem, you can drag this up and make it quite fine. Bring it along to find the frequency that you don't like, and then just cut it. I'm going to keep it quite like there. You hear how it just fills it out a little bit, but you can't quite hear it. I think that sounds good for now. We'll come back to it if we hear any problems later. Again, we want this to be below 10, so I might bring everything that's been mixed so far down a little bit. It's a very good habit to get into. We want as much space. Sorry, let me bring that. So you do Command and click each of the tracks you're looking to move. And then we bring them all down by, I don't know, 3 decibels maybe. Now you're noticing probably that this growl is it's almost too prevalent. Bring it down a little bit. Again, the name of the game here is just balance, and then we can play around with giving everything, putting everything in the forefront later. Okay, so we've got quite a lot of these high-end synths here. I'm going to work on those. I mean, actually, I'll start with the strings. That'll fill out the padding of the song. I mean, they sound great as they are. They're not really interfering with the mix. It's just about getting the volume right. But what I will do is add that low pass. Or sorry, high cut. Low cut, sorry. Yeah, just to remove any frequencies that might be in there. And again, I want my EQ to come first there. You can do that by clicking the plugin and swapping it with the other one. I'll do the same here. Just cutting out any. I might bring it up a little bit at the end as well, because it's quite a high. Just makes it excites it a bit, gives it a bit of a higher presence. Again, like I said again, we've EQing is about shaping sounds, surgically removing frequencies that cause problems, making sure that certain parts can fit together, and then just boosting them in the right frequency so that you can still hear the part in the song without it interfering with anything else. Hear the difference when you turn the mono off? Okay, let's get stuck into some of these messy synth leads that all sound very similar. If they're in the same range frequency-wise, a good thing to space them out is to pan. Now, I would even pan that further. I can do this without even listening. I just know that these are all going to clash a bit, so I want to pan them a little bit left and right. Keep something like, this is an FX. Let me turn that up. Keep that in the middle. You might hear some dissonance here. Dissonance is when you've got sounds that sort of sound like they're out of tune. It creates tension, especially in horror music. I think there's some in here, and again, that's intentional, but it might sound a bit foreign to your ears, so I might bring it down a little bit. These top two are the leads, so we want them to be a bit louder than everything else in terms of all these synths. The other sounds are more sort of ear candy, background, FX, color. These are playing the same thing, but they're slightly different sounds. balanced. I mean, I've got everything, I think, apart from the end section. Now, this end section is the most important. This is what you might notice everything sounded a bit sort of centered here. We wanted to get really heavy in the end, and what I'll often do is record some heavy guitars, but the song actually didn't need it. I thought it sounded cleaner and more like Blade Runner without the guitars. Uh, bring in this heavy section, get it to sound balanced, and then you can listen to the whole track and see how it builds. This is where it starts to get a bit messy. You're starting to lose parts that you could previously sort of hear, mainly the bass. So this is, I mean, the last process in the mix. You get everything as balanced as you can, and then you sort of start figuring out what's not piercing through or what's lost, uh, shaping the sounds to make them fit together. Now I've got not really any effects on these. Just want to get them balanced volume wise. I mean, they sound pretty. So it's pretty good to me, and really next I want to listen to the whole song and make sure that everything else is balanced enough. Tweak, just you sort of play through and tweak. And I've got the gain still on, but I like to turn it off and on to sort of hear the difference and then check that the reverbs are all doing what they should be doing. Reverb and delay, like I said in the previous videos, it's about creating space, putting the song into a virtual room. The reverb is kind of the left to right fields, and the depth is kind of the delay if you're thinking of it in a 3D space. You know, you're essentially panning and reverbing to make it sound like you're sort of watching somebody stood on stage, and you can virtually put an instrument to the left of the stage and the right or further back in the stage. And you know, we just play it through and sort of tweak. And we're starting to get there, but it's not as heavy at the end. And I'm going to just try and figure out why. Sounded a bit more balanced now. You'll notice there I created what's called parallel compression or New York compression. What you do, and I'm sure if you've watched, I've just created an auxiliary channel, a bus, and I've added a little bit of EQ just to boost a little bit of the high end, a little bit of the low end, just a tiniest little bit to give excitement, and I've added a compressor. You can have a look at the settings I've got on this compressor if you want to recreate this effect. Now that allows me to feed, I fed the kick, the snare, and the bass. I would often create a separate parallel compressor for bass, but just for the sake of hearing how it sounds, I just fed that through the drum as well. And what you're doing is you're feeding, rather than adding a compression to the individual track, you're able to feed the entire, send it through a bus, and that feeds the signal from that through this new bus, this parallel compression, and then adds that signal on top. It allows you to do things in a more controlled way without causing the effect of the, like causing the decibels of the master to shoot up, causing, you know, distortion and stuff like that. It sounded more balanced, but I'm going to be honest, I'm not happy with the dynamics of the drums. They sound very static. If I could redo it right now, I would reprogram the drums from scratch so that they build like a real drummer. They get heavier, they get harder, and I would automate as well. That's something that I do in a lot of my tracks, and I haven't talked about in any of these videos. Now, automation, quite simply, is everything I've done right now. You can see I've done in real time, and it stays static. Now, what you do when you automate is you can actually control any of these parameters as the song moves. I'll just give you an example. Let's say I want, I mean, you wouldn't do this, but let's say I wanted the kick to get louder. You press A, double click it, and you've got this line that you can draw. So that's the decibels, minus 7.6 decibels, the volume it's at now. You can simply draw so that it goes up louder, quieter, and when you press play, watch the fader. It controls it automatically, and when you play through the song, it'll move the volume. You can do this for any effect. You can have it so that you're recreating a bass player who's slightly getting louder or harder towards a heavier section. You know, you can really go in and control a lot of parameters. I'm not going to go through that. I think this is quite a balanced mix. And I mean, another thing I would do at this point, which I didn't do originally, is I think I would record a heavy guitar at the end, and I would make the section quite a lot heavier. I think for the documentary it wasn't necessary to have a heavy song. It wasn't used in that kind of scene. And if I was doing it for a film, for a scene that needed something very heavy, I would probably invest a lot more time and money in making this ending section really, really, really huge and epic. But that's it, it's more balanced, it's cleaner sounding than my original mix because I've cleaned up a lot of these basses, and everything's relatively balanced. It's still quite flat. I would probably sit here for another 3 or 4 hours and tweak at it and get it right, but that's the basics of how I would mix a track from scratch.